I'm Jim Rice. I'm the Deputy Director of the MIT Center for Transportation Logistics. There are so many different sources that have contributed to the current problem that exists in our world today, the shortages of products all around. And it's not something that happened just recently. This has been an age-old problem. It's become much more acute in the last 4 or 5 years. You think about it started really become a little more obvious with Brexit, and then trade wars in about 2018, 2019, and then of course COVID. And COVID has just been an extenuating source of a problem. And one of the key common sources of the problems that we're experiencing right now is a labor shortage. Now there's so many product shortages that it makes it's hard to imagine. Because each and every day we think, well, gosh, at least I have my, whatever. And the next thing you know, next week, that whatever is just not available any longer. Most of those can be attributed back to a shortage in labor, at least that as a contributing factor. It's not true for all of them, but in many of them. The case of the problem for semiconductors, for instance, that's a different situation. That's a case where the demand for products has exceeded the capacity that exists. The ability to add capacity in semiconductor production is a long cycle and capital intensive. So it's not a decision that the producers will make lightly. And so what you end up with is, in that case, there's a long lag time between the time when you determine we need more capacity and the time you actually can have capacity. I think we have come to appreciate that labor is at the core of a lot of the problems because of COVID. And that's in COVID, you have a lot of people who were sick, weren't available. We see that that people were afraid to go to work. And then for manufacturing operations and for any operation where you're interacting with other human beings, we had this new space requirements. So you couldn't have as many people working in as densely close confines. And so you add all those things together, and then on top of that, you may have some disincentives when governments provided some funding to people, and many chose not to go back to work. We got sent home and, gosh, we're getting a paycheck from the government, why go back to work? And so that is one of the reasons why this is a little bit different. And 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't, the outcome of those tended to be very localized because supply chains weren't global. Right now you have, and it's been this way for many years, is that most organizations have suppliers that come from around the world. And so they're getting materials from all around the world and they're shipping to customers all around the world. What that means is that anytime something happens around the world, it's likely to affect many supply chains, not just the local ones. Now, you said, there's also something called recency bias, and that is where organizations, and we see this in the news now, people say, well, we got to get prepared for the next pandemic. What are we going to do about that? Well, look, the next big disruption is probably not going to be another pandemic. It's going to be something else. My guess it's going to be a cybersecurity attack, right? That's going to affect supply chains. And then we'll all be surprised. But the thing about resilience is that resilience orients the practitioner towards creating the capability to recreate the capabilities that are lost in a disruption, independent of the source. So if you lost your factory because of a labor strike, or because of a hurricane, or because of a terrorist attack, doesn't matter. What you have to do is come up with a plan to recreate those capabilities. And so instead of trying to worry about what's the next big problem, just think about how are we going to recreate our core capabilities. There's a limited number of core capabilities. And those core capabilities, when you compare to the thousands, if not hundreds of tens of thousands of different sources, it's much simpler to try to deal with that. And the difference is this, is that when organizations or when people think about pandemics or natural disaster, we're thinking about the source or the risk itself. And that leads people to think about what we often say, mitigation. Let's reduce the probability of that happening. Resilience is not mitigation. Resilience is creating that capability to retrieve, recreate that lost capacity. That capacity is going to be the ability to acquire materials, the ability to move materials, the ability to convert or do whatever you do internally, your internal operations. It's the ability to communicate. It's the ability to have financial resources to operate your business. And it's the ability to distribute the product direct to consumers. So it's those 7 core capacities. If you lose, no matter how that occurs, a supply chain disruption ends up in losing one or more of those 7 different capacities.